Good to see everyone out this morning for us to have the opportunity to come here and worship God. Hope that you're excited to be here, that our worship this morning has been very encouraging to us. It's a preview of heaven. This is what we're going to be doing in heaven. Singing songs of praises to God, being in the presence of God forever. And these times are a good reminder of that. We'll be having our singing tonight at 4 o'clock. If you can make it, it would be really beneficial, I think. I like going through and us singing some songs we don't typically sing. It's an opportunity for us to learn some new ones, encourage our faith. If you've been here for those, you know how encouraging those are, to sing songs about heaven, to sing songs about God and all that He's done for us. So I hope that you'll make time tonight to come back at 4 o'clock for that. We're going to have a 2-week series about a text. As I was reading through it, I preached on it before, and obviously we had gone through, I think it was a few years ago, and looked at the book of Philippians more in depth. But there's a text in Philippians chapter 2, it's probably one of my favorite sets of scriptures, that really causes you to stop and think about the mindset or the mind of Jesus. Of why Jesus would do the things that He did, why He would go through all the things that He chose to go through. And it really causes you to stop and consider just how important we really are to God and how valuable we are to God. We're going to spend this week and next week looking at this text. We're only going to really look at one verse, 2 verses today out of Philippians 2. There's a lot of other texts that support what the Apostle Paul is talking about in this set of scriptures. But he starts off this section that we're going to be looking at this morning that really talks about Jesus' mindset. And he describes Jesus as someone who lacks selfish ambition or conceit. Only one point today. There's some subpoints we're going to look at. I gave you a ton of room on the sheet if you want to take other notes as well. But I've read that verse before. I've read this verse a ton of times, and you know, you read through it and you're like, yeah, Jesus was selfish, Jesus wasn't a selfish person. But if anyone had the ability to be selfish, it was Jesus. He was God in the flesh. He could have been selfish, and He could have done whatever He really wanted to do. He had the power and ability to do anything that He chose. So when Paul talks about Him being selfless, or lacking selfish ambition, or being conceited, immediately I go to my dictionary to look these words up, because I know what the definition is, but going through and reading the definition again and then reading what Paul is talking about really strengthens Christ's love for me, but also convicts me that I need to be the same way. Let's just break these words down before we get into the text. The word conceited means excessively high opinion in self. We don't read anywhere really of Jesus. Obviously, I'm the Son of God. I am the Messiah. He does say that. It's not like He walked around and was like, oh yeah, remember, I'm the Messiah and you're not. Or, I'm better than you. There wasn't any of that. Even in the way He lived. Not having anywhere to lay His head. Living in a town like Nazareth. Being born in a manger. It's not like He touted those things and was like, oh, I'm a lot more humble than you are. Look how humble I am. Look at my beginnings. Look at who my mom was. He didn't do that. And see, a lot of times that's where our problems start. We think way too highly of ourselves. Now that's a challenge. I think it's like walking a tightrope. You don't want to demean yourself all the time and say, I'm the scum of the earth, I'm terrible. You don't do that either. But when we always think we're better than someone, or we're better than everybody else, or that we never do anything wrong, we're really setting ourselves up to fail. And as a Christian, as someone who is supposed to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, it's a total opposite of Him. He never thought He was too good to do something. He never thought He was too good. He was always willing to do what His Father told Him. And that convicts me looking at that. I don't need to have an excessively high opinion of myself. I need to taper my opinion of myself, compare myself to Christ, see all the faults that I have, and see that there's a ton of things that I can work on. That word ambition that we're going to look at in just a second is a strong desire to achieve or do something, determination or hard work. Not necessarily bad. Ambition is one of those things that can kind of be neutral. It can be bad or it can be good, depending on what that ambition is. That's why it's in white, because it's kind of neutral. The red is bad, conceited. It's bad to be conceited. But there's really two types of ambition you can have. Paul refers to one of them in the text. You can infer that there's another one there as well that he's really saying Jesus embodies. But he says that Jesus didn't have selfish ambition. There's a definition for selfish ambition. I read through it. Something hit me. I was like, okay, this is going to be kind of my definition of what I think selfish ambition is to me. I'll put it up here on the screen. Focused on you, your wants, and your desires. Focused on what you can get from people, places, things, or situations. Your wants and desires are above others, including God. Including God. Now in the garden, he's not trying to get out of suffering. He's not trying to get out of it. He's not saying, God, my will's greater than yours. Take this cup away from me. He says, no. If it's by your will that it can be accomplished, let it be. If not, I'm willing to drink this cup. Selfish ambition would say, forget what your plan is. Forget these people I'm going to the cross for. This is an inconvenience to me. I don't want to do it. When I make plans, or when I wake up in the morning, if the only person on my radar is me, there's a very good chance I'm suffering from a case of selfish ambition. When I look at a situation and think, how is this going to affect me first? There's a good chance that there's a very good chance that that's probably descriptive of me. We have to think less of ourselves. Not, oh, I'm this terrible person, but think less about ourselves and think more about others. So he's not that way. How was Jesus really? Doing what is best for everyone else, thinking less about self and more about others. That's a good definition of Jesus. Doing what's best for everyone else. Getting nails driven in your hands isn't good for you, in your feet. Being scourged isn't good for you. Leaving heaven isn't good for you. It was for the betterment of everyone else. And looking at these words, I mean, we know these words, we've talked about them before, but looking at these definitions and looking at these things, I see where Jesus is so great, and what makes Jesus so amazing is he doesn't seem to fall into the traps that we all do. Why did Adam and Eve take the fruit? They saw it and they wanted it. Selfish. Every sin can be traced to the root of selfishness and pride. All of them can be. That's why he never sinned, because he wasn't selfish. There's a poll done in 2015. It's a little outdated. It's 9 years old. People were asked, Americans talking about other Americans, what percentage of people do you think is selfish? 28% said most Americans are very selfish. 40% said they are fairly selfish. So people have this conception that 68% of people are somewhat selfish. I think that's probably a lot higher. There are probably people that lied in that poll. There are a lot more people that are selfish than 68%, in my opinion. But do you think of ambition? Paul doesn't say ambition's bad. Selfish ambition is bad. You think of Jesus. Jesus was the most active person to ever live in all the things that he did. There's not a trace of laziness in Jesus, as we're going to talk about in just a second as well. 19% of people viewed other individuals as very lazy. 31% as fairly. So they believe half of the population is lazy. Two major faults that are in many people's lives: selfishness and laziness. And we want to know how Jesus was so effective. He was selfless and he was active. And that's really what Paul paints in this picture when we go through here in Philippians chapter 2. As he talks about Jesus, think about these definitions. Think of the way you view ambition, being conceited, being selfless, or being selfish. And think of really what that definition is embodied in Jesus. Paul starts off this text at the beginning of verse 6 by saying that Jesus was in the form of God. The beginning of verse 6, he says, talking about Christ, who being in the form of God. We're not talking about just some random person. We're talking about someone who was God, who chose to put on flesh. Think of what God has done. Think of what God can't do. There's nothing that he can't do. So if God has the ability to do that, and if Jesus, who is in the form of God, means he is God, he could do anything. And he could rub it in everybody's face that he could do everything, but he never did. He existed as essentially one with God. And you see that, like in his baptism, you have the voice from heaven, his Father, the Spirit descending like a dove on him. All of that in accordance. And he had the authority to say whatever he wanted. He had the ability to do whatever he wanted. But that's what amplifies this so much. We're not talking about another flawed human being like you and me. We're talking about someone who was perfect, who was complete, who could raise people from the dead, give people the ability to see. Lame people who hadn't walked in decades were told to pick up their mat and walk, and they were able to because of this person. Now, I want to ask you, if you had the power to do all those things, would you stay good? Would you stay selfless? There's a lot of people that would be like, oh, I'm going to do this miracle so everybody sees this and they pat me on the back. It's not why he did it. It was to confirm the word. It was to confirm that he was who he said he was. It was to ultimately, as we see so many times, give praise to his Father. By what I'm doing, they may know that you have sent me. Direction upward. Not selfish, but selfless. John chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, John tells us this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him, nothing that was made was made. Think about that. We're not talking about, people say, oh, we talked about this Wednesday night. Oh, he was the first created being. No, he wasn't. He created everything along with his Father and along with the Spirit. You can see that in Genesis. Let us make man in our image. So not only are we talking about someone who could work miracles, we're talking about someone who was there when the world was spoken into existence, who had an active part in the creation of the world. He was God. He still is God. But that amplifies our vantage point of God, I think, that he put on flesh, went through the same struggles that you and I did, and still didn't sin. Because he was selfless. Next week, we're really going to get into the selfless part. But this just amplifies this to me. He was in the form of God. He had the authority of God. Why? He was equal. You think of verse 6, what it says, who being in the form of God did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. Similar glory is typically the way this is referenced. This could be kind of like a tricky verse. You're like, okay, why is he always deferring to his Father if they're equal? There's a lot of questions people ask. But they had similar glory. That's what that means, basically. He was God in human form. And despite being God in human form, he never, ever used that to his own advantage. If you think of the temptation that we read of when he's in the wilderness, when his journey or his ministry's just started. He doesn't like supernaturally do anything really to combat Satan. It's not like he's like, oh, boom, here's this bread. I will eat this, but I turn this rock into bread, not you. There's none of that. He takes on the temptation of Satan just like we have to. He quotes book, chapter, and verse. Even though he's God, he was never too beneath going through the everyday struggles that we go through. We don't read anywhere of him being like, well, I'm God, I don't have to deal with this. I'm God, I don't have to face this. I'm God, I don't have to be tempted. I'm God, I don't have to go through all these things. There's none of that. Despite being God, he still chooses to go through everything that he went through, to leave heaven, to face the temptations of Satan, to have discouragements and disappointments. Now it's amazing when you read that, John chapter 1 again at verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So John says the Word, being Christ, was God. Well, then you compare this to an Old Testament passage. Now I thought it's really interesting because, you talk in the Old Testament about the carven images, the idols. You had the Canaanites worshiping different people. The Israelites get trapped and they go and they worship these other gods. Well, all throughout the Old Testament, you see God the Father telling the children of Israel that no one is like me. No one should be served like me. And you see that over in Isaiah 40 or John 17 or verse 5 real quick. And now, O Father, glorify me together with yourself with the glory which I had with you before the world was. Christ makes the claim there. Before the world ever existed, he was God. He didn't become God when he came here. He'd always been God. So you think of that, before the world ever was. So before anything's written in the Old Testament, he's making that claim. What makes a passage like Isaiah 42 and verse 8 very interesting? Because God tells the nation of Israel here, he says, I am the Lord, and that's my name. My glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carven images. No idols are like me. But then all of a sudden this man appears. And he's claiming to be God. He's claiming to be the Son of God. And as you read, as you go further into chapter 2 of Philippians, you see why that claim is true. You see why he makes that claim, and it's true. Because no carven image or no human being would possibly do the things that Jesus did. None of them would ever even deserve that title. It's one thing to claim something. It's a totally different thing to show it to be true. And every single thing that Jesus claimed was 100% factually true. Because God is compassionate. Well, what was Jesus when he was here? He was compassionate. God the Father is patient. Well, what trait did Jesus have? He was patient. Long-suffering. All these traits you read of in the Old Testament that talks about God, in the New Testament that talks about God the Father, you know how we know those are true? Because Jesus came in human form and showed us that they were. That they may believe in me to know you. It's amazing that we have this. It's one thing if God was like, oh, I love you all. I've created you in my image. But this sin problem, I really don't want to do anything about it. Well, where would we be? Christ willingly steps up, willingly goes to bat for us on our behalf. And you think of like verse 8. He was found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross in Philippians 2. Obedience. Christ was willing to go as far as giving his own life. He just wasn't somebody that God said, go do it. God had to watch his only begotten Son suffer. And Christ hung up on that cross and allowed it to happen. Absolutely amazing. But the second part of this verse that we just looked at, it's really one of the ones I want to hone in on. Jesus didn't consider equality with God to be robbery at the end of verse 6. And you're like, okay, he's God. He's equal with God. So what in the world is Paul referencing here? He didn't view this as something to be taken and used to his own advantage. Now you think of ambition, and you think of selfishness, and you think of selflessness. We don't have the power to do the things that Jesus did. I can't raise someone from the dead. I can't give people their vision back after it's been lost. I can't tell lame people to get up and walk. It doesn't work that way. But you think of how many people in our world today claim to have the ability to do those things and manipulate people off of that claim, even though it's untrue. Jesus could do it, and he did manipulate people. It's not like he said, oh, I'm going to set up this, ministry, and we're going to have billions of dollars, and if you give me, if you put your hand on this TV, obviously they didn't have those back then, but if you put your hand on this TV and say this prayer, I'll fix all your problems. Just send me a check. But it was never about that. He would have much rather someone made their life right with God than really giving him any type of recognition. Now, at times that happens. And early on in his ministry, I always think it's so interesting. He's like, don't tell nobody. What do you mean I'm not going to tell nobody? This demon-possessed man's demons have been taken away. You're going to tell everyone. Don't tell anybody. But how many people in that instance would have been like, tell everybody what I just did? It all goes back to that perspective. He wasn't jealous of his father. When I think of robbery, that's what I think of, is jealousy. There's not one time in the gospel account where Jesus is ever bitter or jealous of his father. Not one single time. Not once. Why is that? Because he was secure in who he was. He was secure in who his father was. And he didn't use that to his own advantage. I want you to think about this. When you read the Gospels, a lot of the time he doesn't really reference who he is. And I think that's done intentionally. His calling card wasn't always, oh, by the way, I'm God. By the way, I'm God. I am who I am. He doesn't do that every text we read. Now, I'll be honest with you. If that was me, I'd be like, yeah, that's me. That's who I am. And yeah, he reveals himself a number of times, but it's never to draw attention just to him. There was a lot of substance in Jesus. There was a lot of substance in who he was. It wasn't just the one-liner of, I'm God's only son. I'm the Messiah. There was someone who directed their attention to something that he believed was much greater than himself. That's really what the gospel is. We're not talking about our righteousness because we really don't have any. We're directing our attention to someone much greater because Jesus has all the righteousness. Jesus did everything right. Jesus never sinned. But you see throughout so many times in his ministry, he would say things and do things so that people would know who had sent him and why he had been sent. Now you think about selfless ambition again. Thinking about everyone else above yourself. He's worried about people getting to his Father. He's worried about people making their lives right. But the crown of thorns and the scourging and the pain and the punishment, that's not good for him. But it's tremendous for us. Selfless ambition. Looking for the best for others. Even though it might be an inconvenience to self. Even though I don't think Jesus viewed it as an inconvenience. But me looking at the story, it is I'm an inconvenience to Christ. He had to go through the things he had to go through because of me. But he was selfless. Now, none of us are going to be able to answer this question to close out today with two more verses. You're not going to be able to answer this question with, yeah, I do. You know, we're talking about the mind of Christ, the mindset of Christ. We talked about evangelism for 2 lessons last week, about how Jesus would work things when he would talk to people and communicate with people. But your mindset says a lot about you. If you have a negative mindset, you're going to get a negative outcome. More than likely. It's just how it works. If you go into a situation already doom and gloom about it, it's probably not going to work. But Jesus is one of those individuals, and really the only individual that we read of in the scripture that could take terrible situations and turn them out for good. We see God the Father do that in the Old Testament in so many different instances. We see Jesus do that throughout his time on this earth. And that's really what I want us to think about as we go throughout the week. And we're going to talk more about this next week as well. Do we have the mind of Christ? I'll be honest, I don't. And it's not a crutch, and it's not an excuse, but we're sinners. We don't think the way that we should. We don't view situations the way that we should. We don't view circumstances the way that we should. We don't view people the way that we should. We don't view our priorities the way that we should. And that's hard to admit. Like, no one gets joy out of saying, I don't know what I'm doing sometimes. No one gets joy out of saying, I don't know what's going on. No one gets joy out of saying, I can't do anything about this. No one gets joy out of that. But I'm telling you right now, if we acknowledge that, we're much closer to having the mindset of Christ than just lying to ourselves and saying, oh, I'm fine, I'm okay, everything's all right. Because I'm telling you, I read the story of Jesus, it puts me to shame how I am. Puts me to shame. I've been set up much better than him to succeed. I didn't grow up in poverty. I didn't grow up in Nazareth. I have a home. I have a place to lay my head. Every excuse I could have has been taken care of by God, provision-wise. And he had every possible reason to have a negative mindset and to be selfish and to use his own authority and power for his own benefit, and he didn't do it. But a lot of times we get a little power and a little authority, it goes to our head, and we think we've made it. He had everything that we all want. And not one single time did he use it in a way it shouldn't be used. Paul starts off this text in verse 5. We left it out on purpose to come back to the end of the lesson. But he goes through here in Philippians 2, and he's telling these individuals, love each other, be united, be of one accord, live in harmony with one another. Well, in verse 5, he says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Now, I may skip over that and get to the section of all that Jesus did. It's powerful. But what Paul is saying here is, Chris, it is possible for you to have the mindset that Jesus had. It is possible. Because that's one of the biggest crutches. Well, I'm not perfect like Jesus, or I'm not God like Jesus, so I can't do anything. That's a crutch. I can be selfless if I want to be. I can look out for other people's betterment if I choose to. I can think a lot less about myself and a lot more about others. And I'm telling you right now, I can direct every ounce of praise I ever get in my life back to God the same way He did. I can do that. It's all, I can't. Yes, I can. I can do that. I can follow the blueprint. I can follow the footsteps. I can see how He handled heartbreak. I can see how He handled disappointment. I can see how He handled success. I can see how He handled every possible circumstance and remained faithful. That's why the Scriptures are so powerful. We can read and see it for ourselves. But this text, as I said, if you're like me, when I read, it makes me think of other stories that I've read or other texts that I've read before, and it's like, oh, that makes me think of this. Probably one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible is right before Jesus is about to die. He gets on his hands and his knees and he washes the disciples' feet. If that story does not make you emotional, I don't know what can. Because that was the lowest job of a servant in someone's house. And you think of how disgusting that probably was, because they walked everywhere. Think of what we talked about today. This is God in the flesh. Perfect. They saw the miracles that He could do. They saw everything He had the power over. And this man gets down on his hands and his knees. He wraps a towel around him. And he starts washing their feet. And obviously they're hesitant. They're like, what are you doing? And Peter's like, I don't want you washing my feet. You know how Peter was. Oh, don't do that. I'm righteous. Don't wash my feet. I'm not good enough. Why would he do that? Well, you think of the text. Verses 15 through 17. Verse 14, they're like, well, why are you doing that, man? Verse 13, verse 12, all these things, verse 11, verse 10, they're all asking questions about why he would do this. And look what he tells them. And I wasn't there that day. You weren't there that day. But he's washed a whole lot more than my feet. He's washed a whole lot more than my feet. In verses 15 through 17, he says, I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who is sent greater than he who sent them. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. Why are you doing this, Jesus? Because I'm setting an example for you. I'm setting an example. The lowest job in the house. The greatest person to ever walk this earth chose to do. To set an example. Examples are powerful because they're applicable, because there's a blueprint there. Now, he might not be calling us to get on our hands and knees and wash people's feet. That's not really what the example is here. The example is to serve people and to put other people above yourself. That word example just sets off a red light in my head, noises. This is important. Why? Because what do you do in situations? You think of an example that you've heard before, or you've seen before, or something you've witnessed, and it calls back to that. When they're called to go and preach the gospel to everybody, they probably remember him washing their hand or their feet. They probably remember that. I guarantee you that was a picture they never forgot. But I want to ask you, are you too good to do that? They thought he was too good to do that. And that's why they missed so much. He was showing them that if he's willing to do it, I should be willing to do it. That's that mindset. There's nothing we read of that Jesus taught that he himself wasn't willing to do. You follow that example, you follow that blueprint. Think if we were selfless Christians, always seeking to please God first. It's the number one objective in my life, is to praise God with the way that I live, with the way that I speak, with what I do with my time, my resources, the influence I have. You think if we were more selfless spouses, how much better our marriages would be. You think of that. Divorce rates, well, they're dropping now because people don't want to get married in the first place. But divorce rates were high, and guess why? People usually get divorced because people are selfish. The scriptures paint a picture of being selfless in that covenant relationship. And looking at that way, the way Christ views his church. Selfless. Selfless parents. Selfless children. Imagine if parents always put their children's needs above their own. And imagine if children looked at their parents and respected them instead of being selfish. Imagine how different that relationship would be. What if people were selfless workers, always punching the clock, always doing what's expected, always doing what's right, because we know we're working for something much greater than just an earthly boss. Christ was the most selfless worker who always gave his time and always gave his resources and always gave 100%. If we were selfless friends, imagine how different it would be if we approach conversations always willing to listen to our friends, always seeking out what's better for them. You see conversation after conversation with strangers at times where Jesus would direct the conversation back to them. They wouldn't even realize they were talking to the most influential person to ever live because he was selfless. And then ultimately following this example of selflessness, being a selfless servant. He was exalted because he was willing to get the job done. He was willing to do what he needed to do, what his Father expected him to do. Every message, every footstep, every person he came across was helping him get to where he needed to go. Dying, suffering on all of our behalves. This week when you're praying, thank God and thank Christ that Christ was selfless. That he was willing to do the things for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. And that challenges me to go out and do more. To be more active, to be less selfish, to think more of others, to put others before myself, but ultimately to put God first. A servant is not greater than his master. If Jesus was willing to do it, I need to be willing to do it. I need to jump at the opportunity to do it and always seek to serve him and put him first in my life. This morning, if you're not a child of God, it's simple on how one becomes one. You have to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. It's attested that he is. This set of scriptures here in Philippians 2 confirms it, that he is who he said he was. You have to repent of your sins, turning away from those sins. It's acknowledging that Christ and God are more important to you than your sin. That serving them is of the utmost importance. You have to confess that Jesus is the Son of God. That's what Paul really does here. Paul's making a big-time confession that Jesus is everything he said he was. Everything he said he would do, he did. We have to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of our sins. You think of him washing their feet. And he tells Peter, if I can't wash your feet, I can't wash anything else. Oh, I want to be completely washed, Peter says. We've been completely washed in the waters of baptism. Through his blood, we can be saved. We can be made right. What a blessing that is. If we've taken those steps and we're not living the way that we should, if it's of a private nature, take that to God. God will forgive you. God will help you in that. I know that I definitely need to be more like Christ each and every day. If you need our help, if you need to respond to the gospel in any way this morning, would you come forward now as together as we stand and sing?